Thanks so much for joining us today for this installment of the AI Risk Seminar Series. We're delighted today to have Bharat Chandar from Stanford University from the economics department. He's a labor economist, and he's been doing some great empirical work on studying the early effects on the labor market from AI. So with that, I'll let Bharat take it away.
Thank you so much. Good?
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm mostly going to present our paper, Canaries in the Coal Mine, 6 Facts About the Employment Effects of Artificial Intelligence. Since this is an AI risk group, I'm also going to spend a little bit of time, maybe like 10 minutes or so, talking about a recent kind of literature review and essay that I'm writing on next steps for studying labor market impacts and tracking those over time. So hopefully you'll find that interesting as well. Feel free to interrupt questions, but I think there will also be a Q&A afterwards. Okay, so there's been a lot of discussion about AI's impact on the entry-level job market. I'm sure you've all seen this. Pretty much every day there's a new article that's kind of wondering, is AI leading to deterioration in the job market already? And in particular, a lot of this discussion has been about the entry-level job market. And the reason that's the case is because the entry-level job market has been slowing down over the past several months. And there have been discussions from the media, from business people kind of claiming that some of these effects are being driven by AI already. And we wanted to study that in this paper. We're looking for canaries in the coal mine for AI's impact. So the question we're asking is, are we already seeing changes in the labor market driven by AI, in particular for entry-level workers? So we wanted to bring some empirical evidence to study these questions that have been discussed quite a bit in media and business circles, et cetera. And the main innovation that we're going to bring to study this question is this data from ADP. ADP is the largest payroll software provider in the United States. And via our partnership with them, we have monthly payroll records through July 2025 for millions of workers. And actually, I was just talking to Will about this. We probably have the data through September at this point. So we're going to hopefully create a dashboard pretty soon so you can track these changes over time, essentially in real time. I'll give a quick preview of the results. So we find a decline in employment for 22 to 25-year-olds in AI-exposed jobs. And what's striking about this is true even if you control for firm time effects. So you look at relative changes within firms between more and less exposed jobs for young workers. We don't see employment declines for workers who are not exposed to AI, even if they're entry level. And we don't see employment declines for more experienced workers, certainly not very substantial ones. We see these employment declines for jobs where AI automates work, but not augments work. And I'll talk a little bit about how we measure that. We're not seeing very notable changes in annual salaries. So salaries are pretty much staying on trend. And I'm going to talk a lot about robustness to alternative samples that we consider to test out of things like overhiring in the tech sector or return from work from home could be explaining some of these results. Yep.
Private sector, public sector?
This is going to be primarily private sector. Yeah. Sorry?
Yeah. Over this.
Yeah, so our sample period is we're mostly going to focus on 2021 through July 2025. We also have some results that go a little bit before that. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about literature. So compared to prior work, the main thing that we're bringing is this large-scale real-time data. There have been several papers that have tried to study this question using the CPS, which is pretty much the workhorse government data set that's out there for tracking trends in real time in the economy. So I wrote a paper using this data set as well in June of this year, and I'll show you the results from that on the next in a couple slides. My main takeaway from that literature is that we don't find much evidence of widespread labor market disruption. Now, you get very small samples if you're looking at individual age occupation cells. You can't really say much about, say, entry-level workers in software development or something. There's just hardly anybody. Once you cut the data that small, the data set's just not big enough. So In contrast, we're going to use this kind of large-scale worker firm panel to dig into very fine cells. Other work, Hamlam Vestergaard does a survey in Denmark, and there's some other papers that do this as well, but they don't really look at time series for age occupation cells in recent periods. I do want to say that since our paper came out, there are 2 other papers that have shown very similar results using data from LinkedIn. So that's Hosseini and Lichtinger and Klein-Tieslink. This one is actually in the UK, so they find similar results there. And then I also want to mention that this paper or this report from Doche and Bantok, that's actually from a venture capital firm called Signalfire. And several months before our paper, they kind of showed these trends in the tech sector. So they were very prescient about what we were going to find. Okay, but let me talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the government data, and I'll give us some motivation for why we started working on this paper. So I wrote this paper in June of this year, where I looked at the CPS and I was saying, are we seeing employment impacts from AI? And the kind of conclusion from that is, no, it doesn't seem like we're seeing any notable large changes in employment in more AI-exposed jobs. So the most exposed quintile is not seeing like a sharp decrease compared to less exposed jobs. And that's been kind of borne out as well in several other papers that have come since then. Now, what about young workers? There's been a lot of media discussion about the slowdown in the job market for young workers, specifically in jobs that seem to be more exposed to AI. So this is just one example from the Wall Street Journal. They're saying AI is wrecking an already fragile job market for college graduates. This came out in like early August, I think, so before our paper came out. And so there were all these headlines that were kind of disconnected from rigorous analysis for studying this age group because there wasn't good data to study this question. You know, you also have warnings from, say, Dario Amodei, who's saying AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years. So we wanted to bring some actual data to evaluate whether these claims were true. And there are 2 primary data sets that we're using. One is from ADP, like I mentioned. We're focusing, for the most part, on full-time workers, regular workers, which means they're not temporary workers like interns and things like that. And we're going to focus on the 22 to 70-year-old age group. We construct a balanced sample of firms from 2021 to 2025. So what this just means is we're going to look at companies that are in the sample from the start of the period to the end of the period. And that's just to make sure that our results are not driven by firms like joining ADP or like leaving ADP over time. But we get very similar results if we don't do that. And so as a result of all this, we have about 3.5 to 5 million workers observed every month. And then we're going to join this data set to some AI exposure measures. Kind of a canonical one that's been developed recently is this measure from Alondu et al. 2024. This is developed by some researchers at OpenAI and Wharton, who developed these measures of AI exposure. I'll talk a little bit more about how they were constructed. And then we also use data on actual LLM usage statistics from Claude. So they released this report called the Anthropic Economic Index, where they associate different conversations that are coming into Claude with different work tasks, and then they aggregate that up into the occupation level. So we get a sense of an estimate of occupational LLM usage on Claude. Yep.
Are the 3.5 to 5 million all in the US?
Yes, we're focusing on the US here. I mean, we really want to extend analyses to other countries. We're hoping to do that sometime soon. Okay, so let's just get into the results. The first fact is that we are in fact seeing employment declines for young workers in AI exposed jobs. So I'll start with just some case studies to give you an idea. If we look at software developers, we see this very striking decline post late 2022 for young workers aged 22 to 25 in software development jobs. And it's a 20% decline, so it's quite a large effect. And so the things you've been hearing in the media about the tech job market for entry-level workers has really cooled down. That seems to actually be borne out in the data. Now, what's striking about that is that you don't see those same patterns for older workers, say mid-career workers or between the ages of, like 35 to 50 or even 50 plus. You're not seeing that same decline in employment. Now, there could be other changes in the economy that could be driving some of this. So I'll certainly talk a little bit about some of the alternatives that we consider that could explain some of these trends. Now, what's striking about it is that you also see the same patterns for a job like customer service. So it's a very different type job, but it's also very AI exposed. So, Eric, who's my co-author on this paper, has kind of like an influential paper showing that LLMs improve productivity for customer service agents quite a bit, and that's especially true for ones who don't perform as well at baseline. So this is a job that LLMs, people in these jobs are quite exposed to LLMs, and what you're seeing is the same pattern where the youngest workers are seeing these employment declines, but maybe surprisingly, you actually don't see that for these like mid-career workers. They don't see these employment declines. Their employment is actually kind of growing at trend. So what about an example that's not very AI exposed? Here is health aides. So this includes nursing aides, psychiatric aides, and home health aides. So this is a job that you think would not be very AI exposed because it involves a lot of physical interaction, social interaction, helping out patients in person, often at their house. And so this is a job that is not very AI exposed, and you actually see the opposite pattern where the youngest workers are actually seeing faster employment growth than mid-career and older workers. Okay, so how does this generalize across the economy? We actually see that you see the same patterns if you kind of zoom out a little bit. So this is showing employment patterns by AI exposure. So the darker lines here are more exposed occupations, and the lighter lines are less AI exposed occupations. And the exposure measure is coming from Alonso et al. And if you focus on the top left graph over here, this is for the youngest workers, and you see this pretty striking divergence between more exposed jobs and less exposed jobs. So the most exposed jobs are seeing these employment declines, whereas the less exposed jobs are not. They're pretty much growing at the same rate as they were before. What's also striking is you see much less of a divergence if you look at older age groups. So for example, if you're looking at these mid-career workers, you really don't see any difference between the more exposed jobs and the less exposed jobs. So this is quite concentrated among the youngest workers in the most AI exposed jobs. And here's another way of thinking about that. So overall, there's been a relative slowdown in entry-level hiring. This matches up with government statistics that's showing, the unemployment rate for this age group has been creeping up a little bit. So that seems to be borne out in our data. The growth in employment for this age group has been slower than for other age groups. Now, what's striking about that is that slowdown in employment growth for young workers is actually exclusively driven by jobs that are exposed to AI. So if you look at the less exposed jobs, those are the blue bars over here. The growth for the youngest workers is actually pretty much on par with older workers. In contrast, if you look at the more exposed jobs, employment has declined pretty substantially, something like 6%. Whereas if you look at these mid-career workers, you don't see nearly this divergence between more and less exposed jobs. So we want to emphasize here that a lot of these patterns could be driven by other changes in the US economy, and we're going to test alternatives that could explain some of this that are not AI. And I'll end up showing you that pretty much no matter how you cut the data, AI exposure seems to be predicting employment declines for these workers. But we don't want to claim that all of this is driven by AI. Yeah.
Are these patterns at all different for years of experience rather than age?
So that's a good question. It's kind of hard for us to measure that. And the reason is that, say you leave the ADP sample, right? You go to a firm that doesn't use ADP, then we wouldn't have really any way of measuring how much experience you have on the job. So that's why we primarily focused on age here. I think the measurement issues are much less challenging. Yep.
How does the average exposure in ADP compared to the rest of measures?
Yeah, so you're basically asking like how representative is ADP of the rest of the economy. So there are some important ways where it's a little bit different. So one of the they overrepresent firms in, say, the Northeast. They're based in New Jersey, so they have a little bit disproportionate share of clients who are based in that part of the country. The firms in ADP tend to grow a little bit faster than the rest of the firms in the economy. I think they have like slight overrepresentation of the manufacturing sector and the service sector. So those are kind of the main differences. But that said, they do have tens of thousands of clients across the country. So we do have coverage of a very broad set of industries in the United States, but there are some ways in that it's not exactly matching the distribution of firms across the US. Yeah. Yep.
Talk a little bit more about what AI exposure, according to that
Yeah.
paper, what that entails.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let me explain the way they measured this in the paper. So basically, they had two ways of doing this. One is that they went through every task in a data set called ONET. So ONET is this data set that's produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics that basically has, for every job, what are the top tasks that people do in that job. So there are 18,000 total tasks in this data set that get mapped to like something like 1,000 jobs. And they went through every task and they classified whether this job would be more AI exposed or less AI exposed. And then they also did that with an LLM. They asked ChatGPT, is this job more AI exposed or less AI exposed? Yeah.
By exposed, that's my question. Like,
Okay.
can an AI do this
Yeah.
job? Is that what that means?
Right. So
Help do this job or? Yeah.
the specific wording was something like, would the use of LLMs in this job save the time to do this task by like 50% or something? Yeah.
Okay.
So they classified every task in this way, and then you can kind of aggregate those tasks up to the occupation level, and the ones where a much higher share of their tasks can be performed by LM or more AI exposed. Yeah. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is different types of LLM usage. So we see these employment declines for young workers in jobs where AI automates work. So how do we measure that? I'll show you some examples in a couple slides, but we use occupational automation exposure measures from Claude. So they report this Anthropic Economic Index that's describing LLM usage for different occupations. And as part of that, they associate these conversations with different tasks and different jobs. And they also classify these conversations about whether the usage is more automative in nature or augmentative in nature. So automative uses of Claude in their classification are things like I basically completely offload the task to Claude and it doesn't really require my supervision or feedback or anything like that. It's just I basically completely offloaded the task. In contrast, augmentation are things like I'm using the LLM to learn, or I produce some of my own output and then I'm using the LLM to get feedback on it. So these are jobs where the usage of the LLM is primarily in an automative capacity, and it includes jobs such as software development, accounting and auditing, and information clerks. So here you can again see that the jobs where it's more automative in nature are seeing these employment declines, and ones where it's less so are not seeing those declines. Okay, in contrast, if you look at jobs where AI is primarily augmenting work, this includes jobs such as management, nursing, maintenance, and repair, you see among the most exposed jobs, you're continuing to see employment declines. So in that type of occupation where you're doing it in a more augmentative capacity, you don't see the same patterns. And here is just to give you some idea of what this means. So automative behavior, AI is directly executing the task with minimal human involvement. And that's things like format this document in Markdown, et cetera, complete task delegation. Augmentative behaviors are things like collaborative refinement, learning, and then validation. I produce something and I'm getting feedback for improving it. Yeah.
I think you mentioned one of the metrics called time. Was there a correction for quality of work as well?
Oh, I see. So no, in the Alondu et al. Prompt, I don't remember the exact details of the prompt, but it was something like, can the LLM perform this task? Can it lead to time savings of 50% in this task or something? But that's for the other exposure measure. For these ones, these are coming from Claude usage. And so that's not based on that prompt. It's just based on LLM usage, basically.
The assumption that quality is the same. Quality.
Yeah, so as I recall, they don't specifically mention quality in the prompts that they use to classify it. Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I was tracking what you're saying with the graphs, but that both jobs that rely on automated and augmentative behaviors are seeing less employment for younger employees.
No, so for the augmentative job, if you look at the darkest line here, the most augmentative ones, you're seeing employment growth, certainly above the average line here, which is red. So it doesn't look like this, where there's this very stark divergence between the less exposed and the more exposed.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you say augmentation is partial automation?
Is partial. Okay, so this is maybe useful to think through conceptually. Okay, so I think there are two questions here. One is about the concepts and one is about the measurement. So conceptually, when an economist is talking about automation versus augmentation, what they're thinking about is this increasing demand for labor or is it decreasing demand for labor? And various forms of technology actually increase demand for labor. They make me more productive in my job, and the firm wants to hire more people like me because I'm more capable of doing this job now because of the technology. In contrast, when it's more automative, the firm wants to hire less of me because the technology is basically replacing my work. So that's conceptually what this is supposed to mean. Now the question is, are these measures measuring that concept well? And I think it's kind of like an empirical question whether that's true, but it seems to be borne out in the data that it is measuring that the way it's intended. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but so in this example, when you use AI for augmentation, essentially you can do the job faster. Therefore, you can just do job of two people. So there will be less need for labor, essentially. So augmentation also reduces the demand for labor.
So not necessarily. It could be that I become much more valuable as a worker because of this technology, and because of that, the firm says, oh, it's profitable for me to hire more of these types of workers because they produce a lot of profitable output for me. Does that make sense? It doesn't necessarily have to reduce demand for labor. In the same way that like technology has advanced over hundreds of years, we're still mostly employed, right? Because we've created new forms of work or we've been able to augment our tasks in certain ways that make us more productive. Yeah.
How does this compare to trends that you've seen historically in other, I mean, assuming we're in an economic downturn of sorts right now, how does this trend line compare to those past periods in history?
Oh, past periods in history.
Entry-level workers tend to see a decline in employment during economic downturns, or is there a counter effect?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I do think that so young workers.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. So the question is basically, do these patterns coincide with what we would see in a regular economic downturn? So I think there is some extent that young workers are in general more exposed to economic downturns. It's easier to freeze hiring than it is to lay people off or reduce wages. Now, what's striking about it is that that doesn't explain why you see these patterns specifically by AI exposure group. So why is it that you're seeing these declines for more AI exposed jobs, but not for jobs that are less exposed? And I think one piece of data that I think speaks to that is that on average, more AI exposed occupations are also more highly educated and more highly paid. And those are the types of jobs that you would expect to be more protected actually during economic downturns than the ones that are less exposed. Yep.
I just be like, we're not in an economic downturn.
Yeah, okay. Also true, the unemployment rate is not very high, but you are seeing a slowdown for young workers. So
Sure,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I mean, the overall
Yeah,
economy
yeah.
has not stopped yet.
No, thank you. That's that's a good point.
A lot of that is fueled by AI investment and other sectors of the economy.
Yes, CapEx expenditure is driving it all. That's totally a thing, but we're not in a recession.
Yeah, it is a good point that the unemployment rate is still like 4.5% overall. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, and whether augmentation drives for more workers or fewer workers depends on like the elasticity of demand for that particular product, right?
Yeah.
So how much heterogeneity do you see even within like a certain strata of AI exposure in how augmentation relates to the loss or growth of jobs?
So are you saying like there's potentially a lot of heterogeneity within one of these quintiles in? Yeah, so I certainly think that's possible. These are kind of just like average effects, but I do think, if you looked at individual occupations, you might see some different patterns. We can't cut the data that much, unfortunately. We have a huge data set, but, for example, like lawyers, we don't there are actually not that many lawyers in ADP. So if we look at that, it's like basically just noise. So there's some extent to which we can't cut the data too finely, but I do think that's an interesting question. Like, are there examples of jobs like within this group where the augmentation like means something different? You know, where the augmentation measures are not measuring it correctly, the concept of like increasing labor demand or decreasing labor demand. Yeah.
Because initially that's how you define augmentation, but you don't want to build that into the definition. So that augmentation is meant to measure
Yeah.
whether it's going to increase.
Right. Yeah.
But it's like slightly orthogonal, you know?
Do you mean like the way that they're measuring it in that anthropic economic index?
It can enhance the capabilities,
Yeah.
but not increase.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of an empirical question. Like, do these measures actually measure augmentation? It's like hard to know what that means. Like, how would you measure that concept? There have been some papers that have tried to do it, but empirically, it seems like it's predicting employment growth as opposed to declines, which we're seeing for this group of, yeah. Yep.
But how much of this is like a function of how augmentation is calculated? So you use a share of tasks
Mhm.
to show that like.
Pause you off. We're doing Q&A live.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
How much of this is a function of how the augmentation is calculated? So you use the share of clause queries
Yep.
that are augmentation versus automation queries, but then you also show that actually like occupations with high amounts of augmentation queries have low numbers of queries overall. And so
yeah.
you could just be picking up on the number of
Yeah, so that's a
queries.
great question. We definitely thought about this. So, okay, so there are kind of like three different classifications. Either the conversation is automative, under this classification, it's augmentative, or it's neither, okay? So there are kind of three buckets here. And I think you're raising a good point that it could be that the ones that are listed as more augmentative, they have hardly any queries. So the way we tested that is we kind of dropped all the occupations where there was either very little Claude usage, basically the first quintile or below. And then we looked at that subset that have at least some sufficient number of Claude queries, and we got basically the same results. But I think it's like a very good intuition that this is something that we might have been worried about. So we made sure to test that.
This is still huge, even including the occupations that you drop. You're still, I think, like the most exposed percentile is like 73%. Quintile is 73, and then the least is 7 or something. And those are all still in your data. That's still a huge range.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I mean, if you think about like the number, so there are millions of conversations that are going into the construction of this index. So that's still like a large number of queries that are coming in. Like, anyways, you know, it wasn't our measure that we constructed. It does seem to predict these employment outcomes. So.
At what point did we just move on?
Here's a great question.
Oh.
Yes, I have some questions. It's going to be hard to do all.
So it seems that during the same time this AI, there was also a big move from the software engineering field to try to lay off people, such as with Elon Musk getting Twitter, he laid off 80% of his staff. And I think other people in the field saw that and they were looking for excuses to lay off staff. So how can we see maybe AI just came at the perfect time for now these companies to say, well, we're laying people off, not scare investors away by saying we're laying them off for AI, not because our company is struggling.
Yeah, great. So if you give me a second, I'll talk about all the various analyses we did. In fact, I think I have some on the next slide, but then I'll also show you results when we take out the tech sector, and the results are very similar. Okay, actually, yeah, so let's just go to that. So one alternative explanation is that there are these industry or firm level shocks that are correlated with occupational sorting. So for example, different firms might have different levels of interest rate exposure, or the tech sector might be different from other sectors in the economy for some reason, because of tech overhiring or something. So we wanted to look at what happens within firms between more and less exposed jobs. So there could be an overall trend in hiring across the firm, across all of their jobs within the firm. We want to know, relatively speaking, how are those hiring changes happening for more exposed jobs versus less exposed jobs? So this is a within firm analysis of more versus less exposed jobs. We're going to run this event study Poisson regression with firm time and firm quintile fixed effects. So this is going to absorb overall hiring trends within the firm and look at it relatively for more and less exposed occupations. Okay, and what you see there is that if you look at the youngest age group, you see a pretty significant and large decline for the most exposed jobs relative to the least exposed jobs. So there's the 13% relative decline in employment for these exposed young workers. You don't see that before 2022. You don't see any patterns there. And you also don't see it for any of the other age groups. They don't see the same decline in employment after 2022. So this helps a lot, I think, in thinking through some of these alternative explanations about firm level changes in hiring, especially in certain industries. Yep. Let me give you the mic.
Just sort of on that point, it seems like usually when you do have layoffs for other kinds of reasons, it's usually higher up people who get laid off, right? Because they're more expensive. Did you compare that against, like, in addition to running the regression, did you also look at prior data about what those shocks might have resulted in from layoffs?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's two things about this. So if you look historically at which jobs are more exposed to interest rates, it actually tends to be people who are less connected to the labor market. It tends to be lower paid jobs, less educated workers, things like that. On average, they tend to face greater employment declines during interest rate increases. Now, we have also actually just collected some data on occupational interest rate exposure using historical interest rate changes to measure which occupations are more and less exposed. And on average, that tends to be correlated with, lower income, et cetera. But we want to kind of additionally test these kinds of analyses looking within firms for more interest rate exposed jobs versus less interest rate exposed jobs, and whether we see a divergent pattern there. So my general sense is that it's not that correlated with AI exposure. So for example, like construction is very interest rate exposed, but not very AI exposed. But we do want to test this further because that could be an explanation that even when you look within firms, these types of jobs that are more AI exposed might be more interest rate exposed. So that's something that we want to test actually in the next version of the paper. Okay, so the next fact is that we actually don't see any notable trends in compensation. So a lot of this seems to be happening along the employment margin. One thing I'll say about that is that it's actually not obvious what should happen with compensation. There are kind of some competing effects. So if there's an overall decrease in demand for those jobs, you would think that would result in lower wages. But on the other hand, there could be changes in kind of the composition of who's getting hired. Maybe it's kind of like the cream of the crop that's getting hired now. And because of that, that would suggest like an increase in wages. So there are kind of competing effects that could be going on here. Yep.
Sorry, Cass.
Wait, let me give you the mic.
Thanks. I understand that for the exposed quintile, like the effects are ambiguous, but if you have for the non-exposed quintiles, we are seeing no real change in like the employment trajectory. Presumably, output at these firms is staying relatively stable, and so the productivity of all of the kind of more senior people should have gone up, right?
Yeah.
So it suggests that they aren't able to recoup some of the increase in their marginal productive labor.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So that's what I would have expected too. Actually, the prediction that I would have had is basically what you just said, which is that I might have expected for more exposed workers who are more experienced, they would have seen wage increases, but we don't see that. There are different explanations that you could come up with for that. Maybe the wages are kind of sticky in the short run, or maybe that it's not getting passed through to those workers. I think
right. It's like, are you able to calculate like the labor share of output from your data, like the labor share of like revenue from your data? Do you have like the total revenue in the companies, or
no? Unfortunately, I don't think we would see revenue. But if you have, yeah, I would love to talk to you about that afterwards if you have some ideas.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so let me just talk through some other alternative analyses that we looked at. One is excluding the tech sector. We get very similar results with that. We also looked at excluding any kind of computer jobs. So that's software developers, but then kind of the broader category around that. It includes things such as like computer programmers, web developers, even hardware engineers. So if you take out basically all those jobs, you get the same results. Then teleworkable jobs on average are much more AI exposed. And so you're seeing employment declines there. If you look at non-teleworkable jobs, there are some jobs in that category that are both non-teleworkable and quite AI exposed. Examples of that include things like bank tellers, travel agents, certain things like that that aren't typically outsourced. And among those non-teleworkable jobs, you actually see the same patterns. And that also suggests that it's not being driven by outsourcing. You see college graduates on average are much more AI exposed than non-college graduates. So, they're doing this kind of like knowledge work, et cetera, that AI is more capable of doing. Among non-college workers, there is some variation in AI exposure. So there are both, very physical jobs, but then there are also kind of desk jobs, receptionists, information clerks, things like that. Customer service is another one. When you look within the group of jobs that don't require a college degree, you see, again, this very striking pattern between more exposed jobs and less exposed jobs. And what's also kind of interesting about that is you see that even at higher age groups. So 26 to 30, 31 to 34, you're still seeing this divergence between more and less exposed jobs. So one thing about this is that it suggests that our patterns are not being driven by deterioration in in education outcomes during COVID. So you might have been worried that maybe school got worse during COVID and that could be driving some of our results. But among people who didn't go to college, you're still seeing these effects, and even at higher age groups where that's not a plausible explanation. We see similar results for men and women, and then we see similar results if we include part-time and temporary workers, and we have more in the paper as well. So that's kind of the recap of the paper that I wanted to give. So I can take some questions now, and then I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we know in general about AI and labor and where there are many directions for future research in this space. Oh.
Yeah, why don't we have a
Sure.
Zoom question or two? So the first, yes. So the first Zoom question is, what will the new metric be for performance in augmented models? I don't know if they mean tasks. I'm sure I understand this question. I guess the question is, what do you expect to be the effect on output of AI in the augmented case?
Oh,
Yeah, okay. So it says, what will the new metric be for performance? So in other words, in the first introduction of computing, they expected output to double.
Mm-hmm.
Now they think the standard is that output should triple. So with AI, what is the expected output increase for augmentable jobs, I believe?
So I can answer this from the perspective of just like, what do we expect the impact of AI to be on productivity? So far, TFP growth has not spiked up. So we haven't seen, obviously there's a lot of other things going on in the economy. You could argue that in fact, AI is kind of buoying the productivity statistics given the other things that are going on. Now, there's a question of like, how is it going to affect productivity going forward? I do think that's something of an open question. You can get a variety of opinions about that. I think the view among economists is it's contingent in part on whether it can automate the R&D process, so the process for which we get technological improvement. So there's a lot of open interest in studying that question. So can it improve technological progress? And then, of course, there's also the question of, is it being adopted by firms? How quickly is that happening, et cetera?
So, is it on?
Yes.
So when the companies automate jobs, so they get rid of some fees, less experienced employees to save money.
Mhm.
So what do they do with the money? They hire other people.
Potentially, yeah, or they could make, man, I think that's kind of a difficult question to answer. I think there are a variety of things that could be happening. There are, major capital investments happening at different firms around the country. So it could be being funneled towards that. It could be
the
that they're
other
more
firms-
profitable.
But the other firms also should do something with the money. So again, I think at the end, the money will end up hiring people.
It could be, yeah, it could be, we might have expected increases in wages, right? We haven't seen that in the ADP data. The other thing I want to mention about that is that we're tracking like annual base salary. There could be things like bonuses and things like that that could be adjusting that we wouldn't be measuring well right now. Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a general answer to that question. The one thing that I do know is that there has been enormous investment in things like AI capacity. So I'm sure that's partially what's going on, but there's certainly like a variety of things that could be changing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just an immediate follow on to that. So the question might be, are AI tools being priced appropriately?
Are AI tools being priced appropriately? So that's also an interesting question. I'm not sure I have much to say about whether they're making profit maximizing decisions at OpenAI and Anthropic. They may be just trying to increase their user base to improve, their models or whatever it is, but I'm not sure I have much to say about that. Yep.
The augmentation versus automation distinction, it's like reminding me of when AI chess engines were first made. And I think the idea was everyone thought that humans plus AI chess would definitely be the best until chess got better and essentially automated. I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, it's hard to predict the future, but it seems to me possible that all jobs will become automated, even senior jobs, but I don't know. I'm just curious your take on prediction there.
Yeah, so one interesting thing about this is a few weeks ago, Anthropic released a new version of their economic index. So they basically released an update. And one result that they had in that was they were showing the share of conversations that were automated versus augmentative over time. And actually, starting around September, the share of conversations that were automative became larger than the share that were augmentative. So before that, a higher share were augmentative. But then more recently, it's become a higher share that's automative. So it is kind of like a moving target that's changing. And as the models change, as people use them in different ways, it could change. Yeah.
I'm curious whether you have a sense of whether these are voluntary or involuntary movements in and out of various occupations.
So you're saying it could be a supply effect where people don't want to enter these jobs,
Yeah,
or they're doing something else.
Could be they see the future coming, so you're just not even going to be a entry-level software engineer.
Right. So they're making choices, they're deciding that they don't want to go into this sector anymore.
Yeah, and we think that could be less bad because people are making sort of voluntary choices.
Right. So one thing about that is if you look, you do have to kind of contend with this graph, which is showing that the entry-level job market has slowed down quite a bit, right? And that's borne out in the government statistics as well. The unemployment rate for young people has risen over the past couple of years. So that's one thing I'll say about that. Now, I do think it's a very important question. Are people making different career choices because of AI? We don't have very good evidence on this. Now, I'm curious, maybe somebody knows the answer at Berkeley. At Stanford, we haven't seen a decline in the number of CS majors graduating so far, or in the amount of course enrollment in CS classes. There could be a variety of reasons for that. But if there was an article that came out in The Atlantic where they made the claim that different colleges are seeing actually pretty marked declines in CS enrollment. So I think it's very much an open question, like how people are making different career choices.
I think we should move on and then
Okay,
have a general
great.
Q&A.
Yeah, okay, great. So this is kind of related to this discussion right now. Like, what do we know and what do we not know about AI and labor markets right now? So this is kind of my opinion about what we know and what directions there should be for future research. This is an essay that I'm writing that I'm hoping to release in the next few days. Okay, so first, I think it is correct that the overall impact of AI on aggregate employment is likely pretty small right now. So that's been borne out in, I think, both our study and in various studies that have used government statistics. But I also think it's likely that AI is diminishing hiring for AI-exposed entry-level jobs. Insofar as you believe that our estimates are causal, you would probably agree with me. If you have some concerns about, are we picking up a causal effect or are there other things going on, you should update less accordingly. But my opinion is that our evidence does suggest that this is true. So my view is the next steps that would be useful here, especially for maybe people who are interested in this community, building employment trackers using high quality data, including things like ADP, also things like the CPS. I think making more people have access to high quality labor market data sets is probably very important. It can't be just that people who have access to these private data sets can study these questions. So I think increasing government collection of these kinds of data set would be very socially valuable. And then I think, to improve on the dimension of, are we measuring causal effects well? I think if we could gather data on firm AI adoption, so when are firms adopting AI, how much are they using it? We could get probably sharper analyses of before and after within firms. And then ideally, of course, you would want an experiment, an A/B test on adoption at different firms. I also think that AI exposure measures are better than most people think. It's like not obvious that these should be good, right? Like the Alon-do-it-all measures are, they just ask ChatGPT to classify different jobs into more or less exposed. Now, there are two kinds of pieces of evidence that suggest that these actually aren't that bad, in my opinion. One is that it actually seems to correlate pretty strongly with actual AI usage. So this paper using Microsoft Copilot data actually found that these Alon-do-it-all measures predicted the usage of those models pretty well. And then insofar as you think that our results are measuring a causal effect, those are also offering some validation of these exposure measures because, insofar as they're predicting employment changes. Now, I think next steps here would be collecting large-scale data from AI labs on actual usage by occupation. Okay, so the other area where I think we're seeing a lot of very interesting progress is new evidence on where we expect AI to improve going forward. So there's a lot of ongoing work by people at Stanford and elsewhere that's working on this question. There's also this recent report from OpenAI that came out called GDP-Val, where they looked at tasks within, tasks within different occupations. So for different jobs, they asked, what are the main tasks that you do at this job? And then they got human performance on that, and they got LLM performance on that, and they compared, do people prefer the LLM output or the human output? And you can kind of see how that's evolved over time across different models. And you can see that there are certain jobs, including things like software development, where the LLMs are being graded actually better than the humans are. There are other jobs where that's not true. So what's interesting is seeing how these patterns are evolving over time for different types of occupations and tracking where we're seeing more progress. And that can give us a better sense of where we're going to see LLM improvement going forward in the future. And another idea for doing something like this might be doing something like prediction markets for future disruption by occupation. Yep.
Since we can't read the axes.
Sorry.
Can you just explain what's
Yeah.
on these
These are
axes and what the colors represent?
Yeah, so these are just different LLMs. So this is GPT-4o. The one over here is the Claude Opus, whatever the latest Claude is. Yeah, so this one actually is funny because OpenAI released this paper, but then it turned out that Claude performed better on this measure than their model. But yeah, so the red one over here is Claude, and then this one is GPT-5.
And are humans not on here?
Humans are this red dashed line. So basically, this is asking, if you show the output for human versus you show the output for the LLM, what do people prefer? And this line is like 50%. So if you're above this line, people prefer the LLM more. Okay, so the reason this matters is we want to know like which jobs will be exposed going forward, and we want to be able to measure AI progress and predict future AI progress. Okay, more areas for data. We don't know anything about other countries, basically. There's one paper from the UK, but this is like a huge data gap. Firm adoption is very confusing, both conceptually and in terms of measurement. So how do you measure whether a firm has adopted AI? Is it that like one person is using it in the firm? Is it that like everyone is using it in the firm? So conceptually, it's not clear what this means. And then if you look at the numbers, you get like just drastically different estimates from different sources. So RAMP estimates that it's like 50%. Other companies have found similar things. The US government is estimating it 9%, which seems very unrealistic. And one thing that's actually making this even more confusing is that the recent paper from OpenAI about how people are using ChatGPT found that a lot of consumer like usage of the consumer ChatGPT app is work-related. So if you're looking at like firm subscriptions to AI products, you're not going to pick that up. So it's not that clear how to measure this. So better data collection and modeling about how to do this is, I think, quite important. Okay, then the other thing, this came up a little bit, what is happening with education? I think the data here is just insanely like lacking. So are people changing their major choices? We have no idea. Are people changing their career choices? There's like literally no data on this. How is it impacting learning? I don't know. How is it changing curricula? I don't know. Like how valuable is personalized learning? There's just like very little data on any of this. So we just need to collect just like basic stuff on this front. The one thing we do know is that a lot of students are using it. As I'd expect teachers are using it too. Okay, and then this is an interesting question. How is AI affecting labor market matching? So on the one hand, it could reduce frictions. It could be easier for me to apply to jobs, write a good resume. If I'm not a native English speaker, or if I don't have the resources to know how to do these things, it could help me a lot in writing, being a better applicant to jobs. On the other side of that, AI could help with screening applicants. There's evidence on kind of both of these things that it can help on both of those fronts. On the other hand, if you think about this in equilibrium, kind of like as an economist, if everyone's resumes are AI generated and all the screening is AI generated, you could imagine that you're not going to get very good signal out of the job market, and that could lead to deterioration in matching. So there's some evidence from this. So this is from a paper by Wiles and Horton. So the number of minutes, you probably can't read this. I'll just say what it is. This is the number of minutes recruiters spend writing a job post. And in the treatment group where they can use AI, this has drastically fallen. So you can write the job post in like a fraction of the time that you would have otherwise. And so there are a lot of these like ghost job posts that they're not actually trying to hire for, but they just post it anyways because it's basically costless for them to do that. Okay, so data on measuring the health of the matching process in the economy would be good to collect and start measuring. How is it going to affect income and wealth inequality? There's one paper that I really like on this topic where they look at, there's different types of exposure. Like labor exposure is more concentrated at the upper end of the income distribution because, like I mentioned, it's more educated jobs that are more exposed on average. On the other hand, these people also have investment income much more than people down here do. So there's kind of this trade-off between like labor market risk versus financial exposure to the growth that could be coming from AI. And how are government benefits also factoring in here is also an interesting question. Yep.
Sorry, what is this showing?
Yeah, so this is showing like what share of your total income is coming from different sources. And the big blue one here is wages, right?
What
So
is the horizontal axis?
it's your place in the income distribution. So this is like the highest income people, this is the lowest income people. So for higher income people, a lower share of their income is coming from their labor, and a higher share is coming from, investments, basically. So this is from the UK. We don't know what this looks like in other countries, and we don't know impacts of kind of counterfactual policies. And I guess I'll just end with that. We need more theory on an economic front for thinking through these models of labor market impacts kind of structurally structural models that are empirically calibrated where we can like say, what happens if we change this policy? Like what would be the impacts on inside the model? I have seen essentially no work on that front, and that would be very valuable as well. So those are just kind of like my high level thoughts on where we should be doing research in this space. Hopefully interesting to some of you all who are interested in AI risk.